so cubish. I want to kind of add some indentations. Go ahead and bevel that edge and snap those points to the grid. Extrude those edges, extrude them again, kind of clean it up. Use the split polygon tool to clean that back up. And now the lower half of this is a little bit more interesting instead of just being just kind of a box. And let's do even more reuse. I'm going to take this pillar and repurpose it for this lower section again. Made it a little bit thinner. So once I do the texturing, I might have to adjust the UVs on this piece. And now that we got those guys in there, let's just bring up the concept art. Make sure that we're still tracking to keep a similar look and feel. And we're going to reuse this light fixture from the right hand side. Place that around, as well as this kind of fluorescent looking one. And now I want to check what we've done so far against the right hand building. So I'm just going to kind of frame both of those really quickly just to make sure that we're keeping consistent look. And now I'm going to go in here using the split polygon tool, holding down X to snap it to the grid. Just kind of model out some paneling here. Go ahead and take those edges and push them back. And then once we do that, we'll go and clean up these extra verts and edges that we have. Just like so. And then I'm going to go make a primitive box. And we're just going to kind of box model this a little bit to make a little bracket piece. Make a few cuts, pull this out. Just something that looks like some kind of, sci-fi clasp, something like that. There we go. We'll duplicate that over. Now, depending on what kind of game engine you're working on, this might be way too high poly, or it might not be enough polygons. That's totally going to depend. Some of these details, like the panel that I'm making, you could put that in texture. I'm going to leave it as a model right now just so you can kind of get the idea of what I want this building to look like. But it might be that when I do the texturing for this, I take those new panels that I made and actually just bake that into a texture and redo the modeling to make it flat. So for now, this is all just a best guess. Things will have to change, like I mentioned before, once we do lighting and texturing. So I'm cleaning up this lower section a little bit, got rid of some of the faces that we weren't going to see. And we're going to elaborate on this, kind of like what we did with the paneling, just so it's not a big, flat, boring face. We're going to create something that has a little bit more interest. And so using the split polygon tool and some extrusions, some bevels. Here I just started with a primitive cube, and I'm just messing around, pushing and pulling the points. In the case of this piece, I didn't really know what I wanted. I was just kind of messing around. Selected a bunch of edges. In fact, here I selected all the edges and did a bevel on it, which can be a little bit messy, but gives you a nice rounded look sometimes. And then I'm going to repurpose some of these elements from the building on the right just to make this little panel section here look more busy. Go ahead, use the split polygon tool and delete some of these faces that we don't need, just to give that kind of another level. It was looking a little bit flat. So I'm not done with this lower wall yet. I'm going to delete this edge and then use the split polygon tool to rough out another panel size shape. And then what I did right there is I selected those edges and then I beveled them, which is a trick to kind of duplicate up an edge. And then using the insert edge loop tool, created another cut down the middle of them and just pushed that back. Again, here I'm using the split polygon tool to make kind of a interesting panel looking shape. And what I'm going to do with these is actually delete these faces once I get them how I like, and then use the inner ring of edges to create new curves. And then we're going to offset these curves and create more paneling that way. So still doing more of the same, creating a curve off the inner edge, offsetting the curve, and filling in the holes using the fill hole tool. Just go ahead and refine this face a little bit more. And now I'm going to add more detail to this face by starting with a sphere, chopping off the bottom half. And we'll go ahead and use the bridge tool to connect those up. And play with the size and spacing of these. just to give us some kind of, I don't know, some repetitive detail on top of this panel. And now a little bit more of the same. Just take some of these edges, make sure they're on the grid. Use the split polygon tool to add some more indentations here. And that's about it for that lower wall for now. We'll put some of these details back in that we had reused from the right-hand building. And so now let's move on to the far left-hand side of the structure, figure out what we're going to do there. Draw out a new curve using the EP curve tool. That looks pretty interesting. You'll notice that I deleted the blockout that was in place. And this will be our lower wall section. I probably could have made this reusing something from a previous piece on the right hand side, but I don't know, I felt like doing something new. It wasn't quite working, so I deleted the lower half, and what I'm going to do is now just use this for the top section, refine it a little bit more to fit, and then we're going to flip it and mirror it so it's kind of like a lower and upper trim as well. There we go. You always want things to look cohesive and together. Geometry should always meet up nicely wherever possible. So now I'm going to steal this edge off here and revolve it around, just so that the lower wall now becomes part of the, I don't know, this looks kind of like a smokestack. Same thing here. I want that upper edge to continue around. And now it looks very cohesive and together. Go ahead and weld these pieces so that they're one, and compare it to the concept art. It's looking pretty good. And make a bottom trim. Again, using that same technique where we stole the edge from the bottom and just did an offset and then a loft. So we're getting pretty close to finishing up this building. Just going to refine the top of this smokestack a little bit more. We'll go ahead and delete the original block out and just using some latticing, some extrusions, go ahead and soften those edges. So for now I'm just using that combo of the lattice tool, extruding edges, softening edges, sometimes the cut faces tool. I'm just trying to get this top thing to look a little bit more significant. Again, converting those edges to verts, then using the lattice tool. We're going to actually make a section of this flat so it's not just perfectly round, and pull some of this down. There we go. That's better than it just being a perfectly round cylinder in my opinion. And we'll add a little bit of detail here for some piping. And duplicate that up a few times. And these are just nice little elements, very simple to make, but they affect the silhouette nicely. So from far away, instead of it just looking like a big boring cylinder, it has an interesting silhouette to it. So now I'm going to move back down to this lower wall, which it became apparent to me was just kind of flat and boring. And I'm going to add a paneling that's very similar to what we did on the top of the arch, just to kind of pull in a common element. You never want an environment to have a million different styles or looks, but what I'm doing right here is very similar to something we did earlier, so it benefits us in that it looks cohesive. And so duplicating kind of a similar style I used earlier, to me, helps the building look very uniform and together. And like so many pieces I made before, I did this by creating a curve and offsetting it. And I filled in the face right there by using the Create Polygon tool and just making a new polygonal face on the top of that. Go ahead and trim off those edges that we don't need. And then create a curve out of this edge and redo the left-hand side of this panel. Previously it was a little bit too large, so I thinned it up a little bit. And now the last thing we're going to do on this building is this hose area Up to this point, everything in this back building's been pretty large and massive, so adding a smaller element, something more detailed, I think will kind of help offset that. So just starting with a cylinder, I'm just doing a bunch of extrusions and snapping, using the lattice tool to keep that to the grid. Let's get rid of some of these edges we don't need. Shorten that up and extrude it, just so we can make that a little bit more significant there, a little bit thicker. And pull those edges back so that we don't have a perfect 90-degree angle. And now to make our hose, we're just going to use the EP curve tool to draw out a curve, and then convert it to a CV curve, smooth it out a little bit. And then I'll create a new profile curve from the piece we made and use that and extrude it down the new curve we made for the hose. Go ahead and weld that all together and we'll soften the edges. There we go. And just add some cuts and extrusions. Refine this piece on the top. Make sure the diameter is snapped to the grid. Go ahead and put this into one group. Adjust the pivot point. And just kind of refine where it sits. Probably make that a little bit thinner on the top. It's a little bit too fat. It was actually clipping through part of the arch in an odd way. That's what I was talking about. You always want things to line up nice. So let's just manipulate this curve. And we'll take that same profile we used for the main hose and extrude it down, and then after the extrusion, go ahead and play with the size a little bit more. Now it looks like a nice little kind of bracket fitting. Just push and pull those points. And that's looking pretty good. So I'm going to go in and double click some of these edges and get rid of some of these polygons. There's too many polygons for a piece that's that high up in the scene. I also don't want this hose to just be jammed into this wall here. So I'm going to create a little primitive cylinder and use this to trim out a little area for the hose to go into. Move that guy back down there. Do another set of cuts. Just delete that face. Move it up a little bit. Now the hose has some place it's going into instead of just hitting that wall. So since I've done that, we'll duplicate the piece, mirror it using the scale tool, and weld it together into one piece. And then create some more curves, offset those curves, and just try and create an interesting looking housing. And then we'll create one more curve, offset it, and then push this back. Take those edges, push them back, soften them. Now that hose looks better integrated into that wall. And please remember that the whole time I'm modeling this, I'm continuing to look at the concept art. I'll kind of pop it up on the screen every once in a while during the DVD just to show you, so you can see our progress. But I want you to realize that I'm looking at it a lot more frequently than I'm showing it in the DVD. Anytime I'm about to start on a new section or a little area, I always look at the concept to get ideas, make sure I'm going in the right direction. So we're doing a little bit of cleanup on some of these elements, moving them a little bit closer to the building. And then the final thing we're going to do is add some of the piping that we have on this right-hand building and integrate it into this building as well. And so using the same little piping kit I came up with earlier, I'm just kind of throwing some stuff around until it looks right. Go ahead and bend that around this curve here. And since I have consistent pivot points and the sizes and diameters and everything are on the grid, it's very easy to snap this together. You'll see that that fitting snaps right in. And these pipes are nice because it gives the scene kind of a common element. And that about does it for this back archway building. See, I'm going to look at it from a couple different angles here, just to make sure it reads good. Doesn't look too thin, looks nice and heavy. And that'll about do it for now. We'll see you in the next chapter.